The scariest creepypastas that terrified us as kids. I can remember it like it was yesterday. Being at my friend's house at a sleepover, hanging out in the pillow fort we just built, watching scary videos on his iPad mini. Videos that subsequently caused my friend to pee the bed, and me to call my mom crying because I couldn't sleep. The videos that we were watching were people reading creepypastas, and at the time, they were the most terrifying thing a young bro could imagine. Whether a similar situation happened to you a decade ago, or maybe even last week, if you can relate to watching creepypastas late at night, then today's video is going to be nostalgic. But in case you're unfamiliar with creepypastas at all, and you've never been exposed to any of the original stories, don't worry, because you're about to get a masterclass in early internet horror culture. And if you're still confused on what a creepypasta even is, it's really just an online horror story that got shared around a lot. The intro story I just told was not a creepypasta. It was real. I truly do still remember it to this day because this sleepover really opened my eyes to online horror, although in a very unfortunate way. Mainly because the person I was sleeping over with, I was sharing a bed with. And not only did they pee the bed, but they peed on me. So in retaliation, I peed on them in their bed. Just kidding. Or am I? Regardless, the creepypasta that caused us both so much distress was one of the most iconic of all time. It is known as Jeff the Killer. And since this creepypasta traumatized me most as a kid, it deserves the first spot on this list. Looking back at it, after recently rereading the Jeff the Killer creepypasta, it's kind of hilarious how much this scared me, considering how poorly the story is actually written. And there's a good chance that the person who wrote the Jeff the Killer creepypasta was no older than 14. If you're unfamiliar, the Jeff the Killer creepypasta all kind of orbits around this one singular image. An image of a disfigured person with bright white skin, deep black eyes, a wide red smile, and thin black hair. The image, admittedly, is creepy, and is likely burned into a lot of our psyches from being exposed to it so much at such a young age. Interestingly, the Jeff the Killer character and the creepypasta associated with it came out at different times and were created by completely separate people. The actual character of Jeff the Killer was created by somebody with the alias Seuser, and this person exclusively created the aesthetic and the actual character known as Jeff the Killer. However, the creepypasta associated with this character was published by an online user named Game Fuel TV and appeared online roughly around 2011, which is probably the same year that I was exposed to it as well. It's pretty cool that somebody could just create an image, toss it online, and somebody else could write an entire backstory and then have the entire ensemble just explode in popularity. But that was something I learned doing research for this that I thought was interesting. I'm not going to read all of the creepypastas I'm mentioning in this video, but I will be giving brief summaries for each of their stories in case you're either unfamiliar or just need a refresher on the actual lore of the creepypasta. The entire Jeff the Killer story centers around a teenage boy named Jeff, a boy that was only roughly 11 or 12 years old, and he and his family moved to a brand new town where his life essentially got flipped upside down. Not like the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air though. The creepypasta itself goes into multiple action sequences about 12-year-old boys getting into knife fights and pouring bleach on each other and setting each other on fire. But to summarize that story as simply as possible, Jeff stabs somebody out of self-defense and his brother takes the blame for it, so Jeff is still free. And then the friends of the people that Jeff stabbed come back for retaliation at this kid's birthday party, and then Jeff stabs the two other kids, and then the first kid that he stabbed that still lived covers Jeff in bleach and alcohol and then sets him on fire. But this doesn't kill Jeff. He actually wakes up in the hospital and he is completely disformed. His skin is bleached white, his hair is singed black, and his eyes are deep into his skull. And when he wakes up in the hospital surrounded by family, all of his friends and family are terrified by his presence, but not him. During the altercation he had where he literally killed two other children, his psyche broke, which was alluded to earlier in the story because, earlier in the creepypasta, there was literally just random points where the author said, Jeff had a feeling, and then it would move on. Regardless, after killing multiple children in kind of self-defense, and then being set on fire and nearly killed, his psyche breaks, and because of this, when he sees his new appearance in the reflection, he loves it, and he is happy to be this monster. After leaving the hospital and going home, being all now deformed and crazy, he takes a knife in the bathroom alone, cuts off his eyelids, and cuts smile scars into his cheeks, which once he completes doing this, his mom walks in on him in the bathroom, acts calm, runs to get Jeff's dad, they both come back, Jeff kills them both, and then Jeff kills his brother, and that's kind of the end of the story. One of the most iconic lines out of the entire creepypasta and Jeff the Killer's kind of slogan is, "Go to sleep," which is what he said to his brother right before he killed him at the end of the creepypasta. At the time of listening to this story in my friend's pillow fort, there was literally nothing more terrifying I could imagine. And I'm not over-exaggerating when I say that this genuinely messed me up for a few days, and I'm sure at least a few of you can relate to that. Although, if you haven't given this a full read-through recently or ever, give it a read. Or literally listen to the CreepCast episode where they read the story, because their commentary on just how poorly written this story is actually hilarious.
He had a feeling that was a feeling. It wasn't a painful feeling, but it was a weird feeling.
But yeah, Jeff the Killer started as somebody's artistic project on DeviantArt back in 2008. But a few years later, when somebody decided to add their own backstory to this image, it not only gained traction, but it created an internet icon, and subsequently changed online horror and creepypastas forever. I'm sure there is people that recognize this picture that don't even know what a creepypasta is. And if that's you watching this video, then hey, what's up? But we've still got a lot more to discuss. The next creepypasta I want to discuss is one that's almost, if not as iconic as Jeff the Killer, and it's known as the Russian sleep experiment. The Russian sleep experiment is interesting because not only was the story extremely popular and shared widely online over the last decade, but this creepypasta is unique because it is likely the most believed creepypasta of all time. And to this day, I have people in my comments requesting that I talk about the Russian sleep experiment in my human experiments videos as if it's a real thing. Which, if this is news to you, I apologize to admit that the Russian sleep experiment is not real. Although the compelling storytelling and sort of pseudo-historical aspect of it is really kind of believable. The Russian sleep experiment, similar to Jeff the Killer, also has an iconic image associated with it. And it's an image I can only describe as, well, disturbing. It's like a disheveled creature hunched over on a chair, almost looking mummified. Now, if this image is disturbing you to look at, let me just quickly break the facade and show you what this image is actually based on. This is not a real image of anybody. This is actually an image of a Halloween decoration that was slightly edited, which is also hilarious to think that a Halloween decoration fooled likely hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. The origins of the Russian sleep experiment date back to August 10th, 2010, when the story was published to the Creepypasta wiki by a user known as Orange Soda. 15 years later, I'm sure he didn't assume that his story he wrote would still be fooling thousands and thousands of people to this day. Regardless, the compelling story essentially goes as follows. The Creepypasta claims that in 1947, the Soviet government was conducting a test of a new stimulant gas that would prevent the need for sleep in human patients. Obviously, with the stimulant being rather experimental, the Soviet government needed to test it, so they opted to pick 5 political prisoners that they already had in captivity and essentially offer them freedom if they were willing to conduct an experiment. These 5 political prisoners were placed in an airtight chamber that had thick cement walls and multi-inch thick glass portholes to see in and to see out. There was numerous microphones placed on the inside of the chamber so the scientists could hear the subjects, and there was also a PA system inside of the chamber so that the scientists could speak to the subjects if needed. The goal was to test what exactly would happen to these 5 prisoners in this chamber after being exposed to the stimulant gas and no sleep for 30 days. Once the test subjects were placed in the chamber, the door was shut and sealed, and communication from the scientists to the subjects stopped. The chamber slowly began to fill with the perfect ratio of stimulant gas to air to ensure that the subjects were consistently dosed with this chemical without causing an overexposure and chemical toxicity. The story goes on to claim that only a few days into this experiment, people's psyches begin to crumble. And 4 days into this 30-day experiment, these people went from having casual conversations with each other to being very paranoid about each other, talking almost exclusively about traumatic and dark experiences, and then only 6 days into the experiment, basically avoiding each other altogether, being very paranoid and suspicious of each other. Because of this, all of the subjects would whisper into the microphone to the scientists things about the other subjects, almost trying to barter with the scientists, offering information on the other subjects in return for freedom. Shortly after this, one of the subjects began screaming at the top of his lungs, and he screamed until he couldn't scream anymore. And then another subject began to scream until he couldn't scream anymore. It was after the screaming began that one of the non-screaming patients decided to use fecal matter and newspaper to cover up all of the portholes, and then the chamber went quiet. And at this point, the scientists had no input. They couldn't see inside the chamber, they couldn't hear anything inside the chamber, and they weren't even sure if the people inside were alive. The scientists had a rule of not disturbing anything inside the chamber so that they could monitor the actual side effects of being exposed to the stimulant and the stimulant only. Roughly 14 days into the experiment, the scientists broke the rule and made communications with the subjects inside. But it was at this point when they got an interesting reply. Only one of the subjects calmly replied, telling the scientists that they didn't want to leave the chamber anymore. They didn't want to sleep, and they didn't want to live in a world without this chemical stimulant. The scientists were shocked and didn't know what was going on inside and who was alive. So they made the decision to go inside the chamber and check it out. Soviet soldiers opened the chamber, went inside, and saw likely one of the most disturbing sights they had ever seen. All of the living subjects at this point were disheveled, malnourished, and had picked away at their own skin and flesh. Blood was everywhere, and one of the subjects was literally eaten alive by the others, and his flesh was used to clog one of the drain holes in the floor, likely to keep a higher concentration of the gas in the chamber. One of these subjects was taken in for testing, and it was in the hospital hospital room when he was able to break free until he was once again sedated, finally slept after 15 days, and died. The story itself is really crazy, and honestly, like, I gave this story a bit more detail than I'm gonna give the other sections, simply because the story is actually really good, and it's just so iconic. And if you had the time, I would definitely recommend re-listening to the story itself, and even reading it, depending on your preference. But yeah, the Russian sleep experiment is not real, but it is a great and iconic creepypasta. This next creepypasta opens up an entirely new niche of creepypasta, that being creepypastas based on video games. And I figured what better place to start than Sonic.exe. Growing up, I played a couple random Sonic games on the GameCube, but I wasn't really too deep into the lore. Although when I was first exposed to the story, it still had a rather profound effect on how I saw the entire franchise. Sonic.exe was interesting because for me, and for probably many people, it was the first creepypasta that they experienced based on a character that they already knew and had somewhat of a understanding of and potentially relationship with. Which is why I think for a lot of people, this creepypasta was impactful. The imagery associated with this creepypasta is, unsurprisingly, a depiction of Sonic, although a more devious looking Sonic, specifically with deep black eyes, small red pupils, and seemingly blood dripping out of his eye sockets. Oh, and of course, an evil grin. You can't forget the evil grin. The creepypasta series itself was created by Jack Cranley, and since then has been remixed and retold and continued by others who are inspired by the original creepypasta series and wanted to make this character their own, which is somewhat common across all creepypasta characters. For example, Jeff the Killer appears in a ton of other creepypasta stories just kind of randomly, as if it was a cameo of sorts. But that's part of the fun of telling these stories. The Sonic.exe creepypasta definitely wasn't believable, but it was still somewhat based in reality, which for me, as a kid reading it, definitely drew me right into the storyline. The creepypasta goes as follows. A person receives a mysterious unmarked disc that contains a bootleg version of a Sonic game. They decide to play this game and realize that it's not an ordinary Sonic game, and it's not even a regular bootleg either. The character itself looks demonic, and the gameplay is also twisted. In this bootleg version of the game, Sonic stalks, torments, kills, and tortures all of his friends, colleagues, and enemies in different gruesome ways. The bright and cheerful world of Green Hill Zone was no longer, and was now blood-soaked, dark, cloudy, off-putting, and cryptic messages were common across the entirety of the game, with the most memorable being, "I am God." As you would progress within the game, it would seemingly become more and more corrupt. Random flashing lights, random noises, random images, and the Sonic character that you played at slowly becoming sentient and breaking the fourth wall. This then leads to the actual player who got this mysterious disc to experience hallucinations and then receive an even more cryptic message from the entity that actually created the game. And I'll just leave it at that, as to not get too deep into the weeds on the entire story. Sonic.exe is much like Jeff the Killer in the sense that it really kicked off an entire genre. In this case, the genre of haunted video games, and taking iconic, happy, cheerful childhood characters and making them twisted and making an entirely new reality based off of that. The concept is definitely enticing because the world already exists, and your job as an author is to simply make it as dark as possible. It's also pretty similar to Jeff the Killer in the fact that it's just poorly written. Like, if you really want a good laugh, go back and read the actual story. But it almost doesn't even matter how poorly written the original story was, because it was still enough to spark a movement. So sure, it may have not been a literary masterpiece, it was definitely culturally significant when it comes to online horror. But getting off the topic of video games and staying in the realm of cursed media, I want to talk about a creepypasta that deeply, deeply disturbed me as a kid. This creepypasta was based on a TV show that I watched a lot as a kid, and you likely did too. And the story was known as Squidward's Sewerslide. If you watched SpongeBob growing up like me, you know that Squidward is always the grumpy, kind of unhappy guy. But in this creepypasta, it claims that there is a lost episode of SpongeBob where Squidward isn't just his regular grumpy self. He actually reaches his breaking point and essentially ends it all. This creepypasta was posted on August 8th, 2010, and was written by a user named Squidward, which is interesting. The story claims that in 2005, an intern at Nickelodeon Studios had stumbled upon a lost episode of SpongeBob. The intern decided to see what this episode was all about. The episode starts normally, although the title card is an interesting piece of foreshadowing, where it explicitly states that the episode's title is Squidward's Sewerslide, but then goes back to the regular happy music and everything you would associate to be in a SpongeBob episode. The episode starts with Squidward practicing the clarinet for an upcoming concert, but when the concert comes, nobody likes it. and everybody hates it and boos at Squidward. And because of this, it quickly cuts to Squidward being extremely upset, sitting on the side of his bed, essentially contemplating his life. And it's at this time when all you can hear is a disturbing cry that turns into a deafening sob that goes on for minutes and minutes. And on screen, you can only see the camera zoom more and more in Squidward's face. But then quickly, images begin to flash over top of what was already on screen. Only visible for frames at a time, there was brutal images of mangled, dead children simply interjected into this episode of SpongeBob. But there wasn't just one image. There was multiple images of people that were dead, dismembered, and these were real graphic images superimposed onto the children's cartoon. The creepypasta basically just ends with nobody knowing who made this episode or where it came from or who the images of these victims were that were imposed onto this episode, which was kind of part of the disturbing lore because these were pictures of real dead people, but nobody knew if these victims had justice served to whoever did this to them or not, and it was just kind of all really gross and disgusting. And this was one of the ones that rereading it now, I guess with the Russian sleep experiment, really just kind of got me. Not necessarily in a literary sense, but I definitely have a very vivid imagination, and the way that this is written is you really can't not see what they're describing. I've kind of recommended reading the other ones. I would recommend skipping this one and just understanding that this one is just dark. Oh, and I didn't even mention it yet, but the image that's like most associated with this is an image you'd likely have seen before. Just an image of Squidward in a dark room standing in front of a window. His skin is a pale gray and his eyes are extremely dark. Red pupils, once again dripping blood. And coupled with all of this, Squidward is wearing his signature frown. But while we're still talking about creepypastas based on essentially cursed content, let's finish the trilogy and jump back to another video game focused creepypasta. And this one isn't necessarily as culturally significant as the other two, but still, at least for me, had a big impact and I think overall is an interesting story. It's known as Pokemon Strangled Red. And it's almost a combination of the last two creepypastas I just discussed. This creepypasta was first seen on September 6th, 2011 on the Creepypasta fandom website, and it was written by user Shadow Male Renamon. There's a bootleg version of a Pokemon game titled Strangled Red. A person begins to play it and it starts to seem normal, but a little bit uncanny, and then consistently gets darker and darker. You play as a trainer named Steven. Steven was upset about a Pokemon of his that died. It was a Charizard named Mickey. And this undertone really gives a grim outlook on the game, and then with all of the eerie music, glitchy visuals, and dark dialogue, the game only gets more and more disturbing, until you're literally faced with violent scenes and, well, Steven's descent into madness and his own demise. The story itself is decently well written and interesting for sure, and although it wasn't as culturally significant as the others we've suggested, I figured it was still worthy of a spot on this list, and I wanted to at least mention it. It definitely scared me as a kid, and I'm sure it scared at least a few of you as well. But let's keep going. Let's take a break from the twisted content for just a second and get into the real world and talk about some real things. That, of course, being the Goatman. And if you've watched my videos on cryptids and urban legends, then you would have heard me talk about the Goatman and the Pope Lake Monster a while back. And this ties directly into that, and it's kind of multifaceted, because the Goatman creepypasta most famously associated with the Goatman's demonic bridge, which there's a ton of videos about this bridge. But this video is not about that. This video is about a creepypasta associated with the Goatman urban legend, which is kind of meta. A creepypasta based on an urban legend, based on absolute fact, I'm sure. The specific creepypasta I'm mentioning associated with the Goatman is known as Anasi's Goatman Story, and was originally posted on 4chan, of all places, on September 28th, 2012. This creepypasta admittedly is not one that I actually stumbled upon when I was younger, but when doing research for this video, it was overwhelming how many people felt nostalgic about the story, specifically because a lot of the videos of people reading the story on YouTube today still have comments about people who come back to it often because they just find the story so good. And while it's not the best written story ever, it is definitely unique, which is a trait that's not common when it comes to creepypastas, because most creepypastas typically find themselves either following similar formats or simply using the same tropes over and over again, making creepypastas repetitive and in a lot of cases just cringe and unreadable. That being said, the creepypasta associated with the Goatman is pretty unique, specifically because it doesn't rely on gruesome gore or jump scares or anything extremely morbid. What it does do is lean into more psychological horror with a very slow build-up and a rather interesting payoff. The creepypasta goes as follows. A group of teenagers go on a camping trip for the weekend. Red. They head into some woods near a Native American reservation, and initially they are enjoying the time in the woods. They're playing sports, they're playing games, they're enjoying themselves. But as the day goes on, they've noticed small, interesting things. A foul smell that's been in the air on and off. And now, more recently, later in the day, strange noises appearing in the bushes. Nothing too concerning though. Until you and your friends decide to build a fire and relax. When your group notices that there's more people at the campfire than there should be, but nobody knows who has joined them or why. Somebody sitting at the campfire is an imposter, but it is impossible to tell who. And this is where the slow build happens. There is tension and paranoia building within the group because there is more people than they should be. And at this point, they don't know who is who. And everybody is beginning to turn on each other when the group comes to the conclusion that there is a shapeshifter in the group. There's obviously more to the story, but I think that encapsulates the most important part of the story. The aspect of the psychological element of this horror story. It's not necessarily about the gruesome deaths that happen or the disturbing imagery. It's that you are going out with your friends and having fun until somebody else joins your group that nobody noticed, and now nobody can tell who's supposed to be here and who's not. And then the slow game about who is this and how can we tell? And basically just imagine playing Among Us with your friends, but in real life, and your actual life is on the line. And I'm not being vague to be coy. I don't want to spoil it for people who want to go experience the story in full. But trust me, this one's definitely worth a read or a listen. And I wanted to add it to this list because it is typically regarded as one of the most unique and obviously one of the most iconic original creepypastas. I started this video strong, and I knew I had to end this video even stronger. So for the last entry on this list, I have to put probably the most iconic creepypasta character of all time. A character that has not only creepypastas, but games and movies and then some. This is probably the only creepypasta on the list that your mom has a good chance of recognizing due to the mass amount of Halloween costumes in just popular media. And if you haven't guessed it yet, I'm of course talking about the Slenderman. The Slenderman holds such a near and dear place in my heart because it is so iconic and for some reason was such a big part of my childhood as well too. I remember watching all of my favorite YouTubers play the game. I remember reading the creepypasta with my friends in school and getting scared. And I remember even trying to download the game online and getting a virus on my family computer when trying to be a YouTuber when I was like 10. And don't even get me started about how my pants began to fall off as I was downloading this game, and it was just crazy. There was a virus, but that's a whole different story. The iconic aesthetic and look of this Slenderman character dates back to 2009, when there was a Photoshop contest on the Something Awful forums. This contest was the catalyst for the Slenderman character, and from that point on, it was game over. The person who originally created the character was named Eric Knudsen, and his simple depiction of a tall, humanoid, yet featureless figure wearing a black suit was simple and vague and uncanny enough to spark so many different fan stories and fan fiction, but we're not going to talk about that. The original Slenderman creepypasta story was released on January 14th, 2010, which I just want to say 2010 was such a good year for creepypasta, and possibly the peak and golden era of creepypastas as a whole. Regardless, there is now so much media associated with the Slenderman character. I just kind of want to talk about the character as a whole because at this point I could talk about different stories for days. The general vibe and consistent theme across all media associated with the Slenderman is just the following, is that he is almost exclusively around children, typically stalking them, slaughtering them, and potentially doing other things as well, which aren't even known. Slenderman is most commonly photographed with large groups of children, which is actually where the origin photos come from. During this Photoshop contest, the photoshopping was actually just a group of children with this uncanny figure superimposed in the background, as we showed previously. In some articles, it's claimed that Slenderman even mentally influences these children and drives them into madness, and in others, it's claimed that he simply abducts them and they are never seen again. Regardless, the Slenderman has an affinity for children, which alone is already creepy enough, coupled with his simple yet terrifying look. Part of the charm is the Slenderman is kind of the fact that less is more. Literally nothing is known about this character. There's no motives, he's never spoken, there's really no origin story. He typically was seen in pictures, not videos, meaning it's not even certain how he moves, unless you've obviously seen it in videos or played the game, but it's just ominous. A featureless, emotionless, potentially thoughtless figure, resembling a human, yet missing anything that would meaningfully make it a human. It's kind of genius. And combine that with, vulnerable children just being in the mix, and you have a, scary story. The Slenderman has been known to abduct children either in suburban areas, but most typically in the woods, lurking behind trees and shadows. And I'll be honest, out of all of the creepypastas that I've mentioned and experienced when I was younger, even as an adult, this was one of the ones that definitely had me turning off the lights and running up the stairs as fast as possible. Because, if the basement was dark and I was leaving it, there was a possibility that Slenderman could be there and wanting to abduct me. These are some of my favorite creepypastas that I remember from my childhood, and hopefully for you, this was entertaining and potentially even nostalgic as well. And if you'd like me to talk about more creepypastas, I'd love to do it. Creepypastas are still alive and well today, and while we're not in the golden era, I think they've definitely evolved as people's writing skills have evolved. And if you're still craving some spooky content, check out the video on screen right now. It's a video I made about unsolved missing persons cases, and I'll warn you, it gets pretty dark. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and as always, trust me, bro.